Oh, hello, yeah. Well, work. Well, somebody's got to do it, and I suppose it's up to me. It doesn't look like anyone else is going to. Yeah, so many lazy people in the country. It's dreadful. Anyway, yesterday we had a lot of, quiet news, didn't we? From, train attackers and things, and unfortunately, of course, for the right wingers, it just wasn't as terroristery as they wanted it to be. There was the reform special yet again. I don't know, probably the third one this week. It's likely to be announcement on the economy, which was all the things you'd expect a right-wing party to do with more crypto. Yes, nothing says faith in the British economy like really wanting to deregulate crypto, because by God, when that crash happens, it's going to be quite mean, isn't it? Anyway, there wasn't really very much headline news around the reform, but the one story that did slightly amuse me was the dreaded tale of teachers suggesting that right-wingers like in reform might be a bit, fascist. We had this, this is from the Telegraph, but it was originally broken in the Mail. Schools reform. Compare reform's policies to fascism. Academy chain accused of imposing deep socialist bias on children with its teaching materials. Yeah, I want you to bear in mind the deep socialist bias notion there. Let's move on. Anyway, just to read, a chain of schools that compared Reform UK's policies to fascism in politics lessons has been accused of imposing deep socialist bias on children. See, I told you. Students at schools run by Orion Education, which has 8 academies in England, were taught that the party's policies have been exploited by extremists to spread hate, xenophobia and racism and normalise far-right views. Teachers showed pupils a diagram of the political spectrum in the UK, labelled as communist on the far left to fascist on the far right. Reform was at the fascist end of the spectrum, near the British National Party. Richard Tice, the party's deputy leader, was also pictured on a PowerPoint slide, come to that, under the title, How Can Political Views Lead to Extremism? Yeah, let's have a look at the slide, shall we? Oh, yes, and we can see there, Reform and UKIP are up there on the right wing. It doesn't actually say that they're fascist. You will notice this, actually. It just says that it puts them there. Now, we can have a long discussion about whether or not members of Reform are fascists, but, they certainly lean in that direction, don't they? And when we're talking about fascism, we do end up with a bit of a nebulous concept. But what Reform are really, in particular Richard Tice, are complaining about here is that whereabouts they've been put on the scale. But I'm sorry, but they're not a mainstream right-wing party. If we think about mainstream right-wing thought, just think about a few of the people that are towards the left of the Conservative Party, but presumably still Conservative Party members. Look at Michael Heseltine, a man who basically has said that Reform are a fascist party. Now, is he an example of deep socialist bias? You can't really say that, yeah? Or, I don't know, what about Rory Stewart, another example of a sort of one nation Toryist, who, can't be accused of that either whatsoever. But what Richard Tice and the Reform Party and the Telegraph and the Mail are basically complaining about here is the fact that politics lessons might be suggesting that people who are, basically quite close to the BNP, or as often put it, the National Front of the 1970s, if their policies are similar, then they might well be described as being fascist. You can have your own particular view about what fascism is, and it's debatable, but I do notice that lots of people that don't like me describing Reform as a fascist-leaning party often struggle with the notion about what exactly fascism is. Whenever people try and do that, they do tie themselves in knots, because the vast majority of people that don't like being called fascist tend to hold those kind of views, whilst at the same time not having ever read anything about exactly what fascism is. It's not to do with guys in brown shirts and leather boots, I'm afraid. The world was never really that way, any more so than you can accuse somebody of being a communist simply because, they wear a lot of red stars or something. It doesn't necessarily work that way. Anyway, moving on. Yes, we've got another PowerPoint here, which is the Richard Tice one, which, is just using that as a picture, okay. And you can see with the less learning intentions, which are kind of handy for once, is to understand the views of Reform UK and how they have influenced far-right and extreme views. Which undoubtedly they have. If you think about, for example, the amount of media influence that they have to maintain the constant diatribe against people that may or may not have been born here and may or may not have been going around on trains doing things that they shouldn't, yeah? To explain the impact of the rise of far right and extreme views in society and why this is a serious concern, yeah, which is an obligation that schools have to do under the prevent strategy. So sorry about that, me knowing my job, for example, and to identify ways young people can remain safe online against extreme content. And yeah, there again, that's a necessary requirement in the national curriculum, that basically we have to, as teachers, warn young people about the dangers of stuff that they might see online. Now, extremism here is activities that reject British values like mutual respect, are widely intolerant to each other, reject democracy as a means of governance, or reject the existing social order. Now, you can tie a number of right-wing parties in the UK very closely to, or basically all of those things. And again, it's debatable whether or not it's reform. But this is a group of people who are in year 10. And as such, you can talk to people about, you know, the nuances of these things, whilst at the same time having slides like this. Now, Richard Tice either, A, doesn't want to know that, or B, well, no, it's just A, isn't it? Yeah, because we like to pretend that we're the victim when we're Richard Tice, a man, for example, along with Zia Youssef, who is never off of our screens. Yeah, Zia Youssef, who isn't an MP, basically is interviewed by at least one mainstream media organisation every single week. Yeah, he was up on Sunday. Why? Well, because he just is. Again, let's look at another slide. Discuss. You see, yeah, you get young people to discuss things and maybe come up with some ideas of their own. What is happening in these pictures? Why has this been viewed as controversial? Yeah, that's a kind of contemporary topic that you might well do. People are painting or people are painting and putting up St George's flags due to patriotism, frustration with the government, and to protest against immigration, leading to controversy and division within communities. While supporters claim the flags express English pride and unity, critics argue they are provocative and exclusionary symbols used by far-right groups to intimidate migrants and minorities. Now, I don't know about you, but that is actually presenting a very balanced view of those things. Which is a bit different from the whole frothing at the mouth, my God, the filth they're throwing at the kids. But let's move on slightly. Mr Tice told The Telegraph left-wing teachers are breaching their employment contracts by imposing their deep socialist political bias on children. Now, at no point in this is anyone, I think, in these slides or otherwise, suggesting that this is a socialist bias. That is Mr Tice coming out with, extremist political rhetoric. Now, we don't know what the teachers were doing, what the political biases of the teachers were. They are likely to be left-leaning, but the idea that they are deep socialists is, I don't know. It's very unlikely. I keep saying it here. Very, very few people I meet in teaching are as well, deep socialist as I am, if you like. And even then, I think that's a debatable concept. Happy to discuss it with anyone that wants to. But Richard isn't willing to discuss, for example, whereabouts on the political spectrum reform are. Anyway, moving on, they should be neutral in helping students learn all sides of politics, and we've seen those examples in the slides. It is notable that no reference was made to Antifa, nor violent extremism from the far left. Well, that wasn't what the thing was about. But anyway, I'm appalled but not surprised by this bias from a primarily left-wing academic community. Yes, indeed. And, the problem with academic communities is they are left-wing because, as the old saying goes, reality is very often left-wing. When you look at things, you often come up with fairly left-wing ideas, a bit like, I don't know, the Reform Party and nationalising steel, for example. Anyway, moving on. The PowerPoint presentations included extensive discussion of the spread of right-wing extremism and linked reform to the spread of online hatred against migrants. Yes, I think that's a fairly balanced and fair thing to do. Now, in my job, I do have to be both fair and balanced, but it's very, very hard to be fair about certain things that, if you like, are imbalanced, right? Okay, if you're going to talk about things like racism, it's quite hard to be balanced. You can't sort of go, well, a lot of people do have a lot of good points about the fact that brown people just commit more crime. It's a bit hard to do that, because that isn't necessarily, that might be being balanced, but it isn't certainly being fair, one might say. The two things are actually different, and it's difficult for people that aren't in teaching, I think, particularly Mr. Tice, although he does pretend about these things, to actually get their heads around it. Moving on, one slide said, whilst not extreme or far right, reform has increased public debate around immigration and national identity. Again, I think that we'd all have to agree with that. For example, Reform UK argues for much lower immigration, deportation of illegal migrants and stricter border controls, which it does. Again, that is simply factual. Supporters say this protects jobs and national identity. However, this has fueled anti-immigrant feeling across Britain, which extremists have exploited to spread hate, xenophobia, racism, and normalising far-right views. Yes, indeed. And again, I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. I know Mr. Tice doesn't like it. I know Mr. Farage won't like it. But these are the things that we deal with on a daily basis. If you look at, for example, the coverage initially of persons stabbing people on trains from Peterborough to Cambridge or London or whichever station it was next due at, I think it was Stevenage, you can see exactly that kind of thing, the kind of frothing at the mouth, often by people like Mr. Darren Grimes, who are actual members of the Reform Party. Moving on. The lesson went on to link the rise of reform, which is polling 11 points ahead of Labour on average, to the Unite the Kingdom rally by Tommy Robinson supporters. Indeed, and again, you will find that Mr. Farage himself has often been asked questions about whether or not he'd be happy having, Mr. Robinson in the party. But there are an awful lot of reform voters and indeed councillors that went on those marches. So again, we can draw reasonable levels of conclusions around that. An awful lot of reform voters are very supportive of young Master Tommy. Polls show that British citizens are concerned about asylum seekers and illegal immigration, which is fueling anti-immigration sentiment and extremism. Yeah. Again, I don't think necessarily that you can particularly argue with that. Okay, oddly, with all of the mainstream media discussion there is about immigration, we have seen record poll numbers for reform. Maybe the two are linked. I think it's a reasonable assumption to make. I think any Year 10 student would probably come to that conclusion, given the evidence. Anyway, teachers are then instructed students that they should use trusted sites like the BBC, The Guardian and Parliament UK instead of sites like The Sun, random blogs or YouTube channels. Yes, indeed. And, well, that was a lesson as well about online safety. But I will remind people, like Mr. Tice, for example, that about 2 decades ago, universities stopped their students at degree level from quoting things like the Daily Mail. Why? Because they're not reliable. There are certain publications that you can rely on to give you decent information, and the Daily Mail isn't one of them. The Sun isn't one of them. The Daily Telegraph is pushing it somewhat, and I'm not saying that everything that the Guardian writes is exactly true because it has its own biases, but it's by far a better and more trustworthy organ than, for example, the Sun is. And students should be instructed around those things. Again, it's a lesson as well about online safety, about recognising where these kind of extremist views are. And you can argue about whether or not the Sun has extremist views. Okay, fine, if you like. But nobody likes to be called an extremist. I don't like being called an extremist because realistically I don't think I am. And the average reform councillor, voter or otherwise doesn't want to be called certainly a fascist. But at the same time, a lot of them do want to, for example, take away the rights of actual citizens that live here at the moment. And that is one of the primary things in and around, sort of fascist style groups. And, if you want to use a particular viewpoint on fascism, I do like Umberto Eco's 14 points, one of which is this notion about about enemies of the state and enemies of the people being everywhere and all powerful, and that is very much ties in with the notion of teachers teaching young people to vote green, as I suppose it would be at the moment. And at the same time, point 12, I think it is, out of 14, suggests that at the same time the enemies are extremely weak. At the same time, they're all powerful and extremely weak. So you end up with all of those young people that are definitely going to vote reform because, wow, they all love reform, whilst at the same time they're all being brainwashed not to vote for reform. It can't be both, and yet with Mr. Tice and Mr. Farage and reform, magically it is both at the same time. Meanwhile, I can just carry on, can't I, with the glorious news. For example, I found out last week that this current government, not a reform one, but they're going to bring in cuts as well, basically want me to be a much, much, much poorer over the next 3 years because, after all, my wage hasn't gone down in the last decade anyway. Now, these politicians might want to ask themselves, for example, about why teachers should be, feeling quite positive towards them or paint them in a positive light when basically it's going to turn round to them, and you can bet your bottom dollar when the Mr. Tice's more economic stuff is announced later on this week, it will include vast cuts into people like me and my pay and conditions. Yeah, Nigel said that yesterday about he thought the minimum wage for young people was too high because blindingly it is, at the same time as guaranteeing that he's going to get rid of inheritance tax. You can see where the priorities are, and I'm afraid it isn't working people, and it certainly isn't people like me that have been slogging away at the chalk face, as we call it, for a very long period of time. Still, never mind that, eh? We can just become a lot poorer because we're not important enough in that world. We're not the entrepreneurs, are we? Anyway, we'll return to reform later on in the week when we see what Mr. Tice has to say. But basically, they are a party that are just going to carry on with the kind of Liz Truss. Well, we need to throw lots of money at the rich and we need to punish people that are poor because, after all, they're all lazy. How do we know they're lazy? Well, they're poor. You see, it's blindingly obvious, isn't it? Anyway, do have a lovely day, and do remember, try and avoid all that brainwashing, even though, let's face it, there's a lot of it out there. But one way or another, I don't think it's particularly happening in Year 10 lessons. Do take care.